Gerhard Lohrenz has to be one of my favorite Mennonite authors and historians of all time. Not only has he authored numerous well-written books and articles, but he lived a very interesting life. In 1899, he was born in the Zagradovka Mennonite colony. After graduating from business school in 1918, he served in the White Army as a Red Cross medic, and then in the Red Army as a forced conscript. He lived through the Russian Revolution, the Red Terror, the violent bandit raids, and Soviet famines. While researching my last video on the Eichenfeld massacre, which you can find at the top of your screen, I came across this article written by Lohrenz in the April 1962 publication of Mennonite Life. In it, he talks about the violent bandit raids of Mennonite colonies and talks about the Mennonite response. He also briefly touches on the Zagradovka massacre. I found the article very interesting and well written, and thought that you might like it as well. I'll begin reading it from the top. The turbulent months following the Russian Revolution of March 1917 opened the jails of Russia and brought untold thousands out of the penitentiaries of Siberia. All of these men now claimed to have suffered innocently. They were thirsting for revenge and longing to continue a life of crime which had been interrupted by their imprisonment. In addition to the release of these prisoners, another hardened group found itself freed, and also forced its violence upon the country. This group was composed of citizens who for years had been fighting on the front. Bloodshed and cruelty to them had become everyday affairs. Now they began to murder their officers, to plunder the storehouses of the government, and in heavily armed bands under their own chosen leaders, they returned to the interior of the country. In this interior, where chaos ruled, there existed a third element of the Russian population, which was also experiencing a relaxation of control. The Russian peasant made up this third group. This peasant was now hearing the wild schemes of agitators of various extreme political parties, and after generations of illiteracy and political oppression, suddenly found himself free, armed, and in the absolute majority. He nursed an historic grudge against those who had oppressed him. His ignorance and his absolute lack of experience and self-determination in many cases made him prey to these skilled and unscrupulous agitators. It cannot be said that the Russian masses went wild, but thousands of individuals did. Such uprisings as resulted were distinguished by their destructiveness, cruelty, and the blind murder of all those whose station of life was above that of the common man. With the unleashing of these chaotic elements, Russia, particularly the rich South, was in flames. Many bands, often numbering to the thousands, roamed the country, claiming to be fighters of freedom and justice, but in reality were nothing more than the scum of society, and aiming at nothing better than plunder, murder, and rape. One of the largest and most dreadful of these bands was led by Nestor Makhno. Soon he came to be known as Batko Makhno, Ukrainian Daddy Makhno, and his followers were called Makhnovisi. Makhno represented a type not unknown in Russian history. Stenka Rasin, Emelian Puchov, and others in bygone centuries had been his precursors. Enjoying the sympathy of the common people, these leaders of cutthroats had burned the homes of the wealthy and murdered them in great numbers. Makhno was born in 1889 in southern Russia. His parents were very poor, and Nestor had to serve the wealthy from childhood on. He learned to hate them. At the age of 17, he participated in the upheaval of 1905. In 1908, he was caught and condemned to the penitentiary for life. Only his youth saved him from the rope. In the penitentiary, he became even more hardened as his bitterness grew. Here, he also contracted consumption. When the revolution of 1917 came, it set him free, and he returned to his home district in southern Russia. Intelligent, cunning, cruel, sensuous, and burning with the hatred for all those above his station, he became the acknowledged and highly admired leader of a band of desperados who would stop at nothing. Any meanness and cruelty perpetrated upon the wealthy, the educated, or anyone who in any way could be associated with the Tsarist government or the former upper class seemed to Makhno and his followers fair sport. Makhno and his followers claimed to be anarchists, and as such they were opposed to any and every form of government. The peasants and the laborers were to rule themselves through their own elected committees. No central government was necessary because all were bothers. Police forces, government officials, prisons, etc. were unnecessary and evil and had to be done away with. In September 1919, near the city of Umani, the forces of Makhno won a great victory over the White Army, and as a consequence, immense territories of southern Russia fell into the hands of these adventurers. Makhno immediately sent out his forces into the various directions, with the instruction of cleansing the country of all those elements that might be a hindrance to the development of an anarchist paradise. Peter Oshnov, a leading anarchist terrorist, a close co-worker of Makhno, and the historian of this movement, wrote the following account of this act. Quote, "Not hesitating for a minute, Makhno sent his armies into 3 directions. As a broom of destiny, he went through the villages, the towns and cities, and swept out every spirit of exploitation and slavery. Landed proprietors, wealthy peasants, policemen, ministers, elders, hidden officers, they all fell as victims along the path of the Makhnovisi were traveling. Prisons, police, and commissioner offices, the symbols of national slavery, were destroyed. Anyone exposed as an offender against the peasants or laborers perished. The groups that felt the severity of this act most were the landed proprietors and the well-to-do peasants, kulaks. At this time, when Makhno's bands and other lawless groups were exploiting the more stable parts of the population, there were, in southern Russia, hundreds of German villages, Mennonite, Lutheran, and Catholic, and others. These Germans were of a higher culture, more energetic and practical than the Russian peasant. They were fairly well-to-do and had spacious homes surrounded by lovely gardens. Beautiful horses in great number were to be found in the stables of these villages, and all the homes were well stocked with all the necessities of life. These Germans had never, to any extent, intermarried with their Russian neighbors, and were superior to the peasants. Russian laborers were widely employed by these prosperous German settlers. The German employer generally treated his laborers somewhat better than the Russian employers did, but the whole employer-employee system in that country, as in all countries in which unskilled labor is to be had in overabundance, was arranged in such a way as to be to the advantage of the employer. There was also another cause of dissension between the Russian and German groups in Russia. Since 1914, the Russian press had carried on an uneasing agitation against all German-speaking citizens of the realm. The war against the Germans and the heavy losses sustained had created a hatred of all Germans, good or bad. All these reasons taken together made the German villages of Russia a mecca to the armed bandits of all hues. Here they could perpetrate their abominable deeds, find rich plunder, and still pretend to have some laudable excuse for all their baseness. Since the Mennonites as a group belonged to the successful German farmers, their extermination was a foregone conclusion. The simple fact that they were prosperous justified their death sentences in the eyes of the Makhno bands. In desperation, some of the villages, including some of the Mennonite villages and settlements, resorted to armed resistance. This act has been widely criticized by some Mennonites, especially by those who themselves have never been exposed to the dangers faced by the Mennonites of southern Russia. It has been suggested that the massacres that followed later on in some of these villages would never have occurred had such resistance not been attempted. But this is highly conjectural. It is impossible to enumerate and describe all the crimes committed in the German villages of southern Russia. But as an illustration, let us take the Mennonite settlement of Zagradovka. It consisted of 15 villages with a total Mennonite population of 4,067. On November 29th, 30th, and December 1st, 1919, 6 villages of the settlement were overrun by a part of Makhno's bands. 200 individuals were murdered, and many were wounded and crippled for life. 3 widowers, 72 widows, and many orphans were left behind. The whole village of Muensterberg and 75 homesteads in the other villages were burned to the ground, and hundreds of horses and cows perished in the burning buildings. Many women, old and young, were shamefully violated. Great quantities of goods of all descriptions were hauled away. Had these people in some way provoked this fate? This would not seem to be the case, for while Muensterberg was not poor, it was one of the poor villages of that settlement. In addition, many of the inhabitants were known by the author as true Christians and fine citizens. This happened over 40 years ago. It is now generally admitted that from the Christian viewpoint, it was wrong for the Mennonites to resort to force. But for those of us who have lived through those difficult years, feel that Christ's admonition, "Judge not that ye be not judged," Matthew 7:1, can be applied here. It is fitting, too, for us to remember the tragic deaths of our brothers and sisters, and the sorrow and tears of those who were left behind. To condemn and to judge would be very short-sighted. Those people were no more, and possibly less guilty, than you and I. In retrospect, there are certain understandings to be gained from the fate of the Russian Mennonites. First of all, I think it may be said that had these bandits contented themselves with robbery only, very few Mennonites would have resorted to violence. 3 factors are mainly accountable for the resistance offered: the cruel tortures, the ruthless murders, and the wholesale rape of the old and young. These are the 3 things many Mennonites men simply found to be unbearable. Another way of viewing the incident and accompanying reactions is to look at the history of non-resistance and to see these 20th century German-Russian Mennonites in their relationship to that history. For nearly 4 centuries, the Mennonites had preached and taught non-resistance. Theoretically, only those who through deep personal conviction had accepted the faith as conceived by the Anabaptists could become members of the Mennonite Church. But practically all of the children born of Mennonite parents, sooner or later, did join the church of their fathers. This was true in Russia as in the other countries where the Mennonites lived. As a result, the Mennonite congregations in Russia doubled in numbers about every 25 years. This was a tremendous increase, and to teach and imbue these masses with the original biblical conception of the Anabaptists was a gigantic task. This clash between theory and practice, and the effect it had on the spiritual level of the churches, may be part of the answer to this problem of apparent desertion of belief. Then again, never in our recent history have such large numbers of our members been tested so fiercely and simultaneously. Surrounded by a people different in many respects, a flight of our brethren was impossible. Imprisoned in their villages, as it were, they had to bear the full brunt of the test. Some remained loyal to the principle of non-resistance as practiced by the martyrs of the 16th century, and others defended their family members when they were brutally attacked by the Makhno bands. What would we do? And that is the end of the article. These are some photos that he included in the article, and you can find this article linked in the description below. Thank you for watching this video all the way until the end. If you value this work, please consider supporting me by donating on PayPal, Bitcoin, or by becoming a Patreon, where you can reach out to me and where all the videos are ad-free. Whether you pledge $1 or $10 or whatever you can spare, it all helps cover the costs that go into making these videos.